With just these simple principles, Ricardo is able to make some rather stark predictions about how international trade will shape out. Suppose we have two countries, countries A and B, and these countries produce goods 1 and goods 2. Suppose, moreover, the country A has the comparative advantage in the production of that first good, good 1. That would mean actually by necessity that country B has a comparative advantage in producing good 2. With these assumptions, we can predict that country A will specialize in the production of good 1 and country B will specialize in the production of good 2. Moreover, both countries will be better off under international trade than they were just producing for themselves, just under autarky. To illustrate Ricardo's principles, I'm going to walk you through a really simple example where we have two countries, let's call them England and France, which produce two goods, which we'll call food and clothing. We'll allow these countries to produce these goods using one input, labor, to follow Ricardo's example, and we'll say that these countries have 24 hours to allocate between the production of these two goods. However, these countries are going to have different skill levels in the production of these goods. It's going to take them different amounts of time to produce one unit of each good. These production possibilities are illustrated in the table below. So for example, we're going to say that it takes England 1 hour of time to produce 1 unit of food. And it's going to take England 2 hours to produce 1 unit of clothing. France, meanwhile, has 6 hours needed to produce 1 unit of food, and it needs 3 hours to produce 1 unit of clothing. And we'll say both countries have 24 available hours to distribute to the production of these goods. We're going to begin our illustration here by supposing that these countries are not allowed to trade. And what I'm going to give you here is just a hypothetical allocation of the production of these two goods for these countries, since they have to produce something of each. So let's take a look at this allocation here. Let's suppose that we're going to allow England to devote 16 hours to the production of food and 8 hours to the production of clothing. Let's just suppose. That would mean that England's going to end up having produced 16 units of food and only 4 units of clothing. That's because in 8 hours, given it takes 2 hours to produce 1 unit of clothing, England can only end up with 4 units of clothing. Let's say France, meanwhile, chooses to devote 18 hours to the production of food and 6 hours to the production of clothing. This is going to give France a total output of 3 units of food and 2 units of clothing. That will altogether give us a world output of 16 units of food and 6 units of clothing. 19 units of food and 6 units of clothing. Let's keep these numbers in our head as we proceed. Since we have the production possibilities, we're also able to actually analyze the absolute and comparative advantages each country has in the production of these goods. Let's begin by examining the opportunity cost each country has to produce each of these goods. If England wants to produce 1 unit of clothing, it needs to devote 2 hours to producing that 1 unit of clothing. In those 2 hours, England could have instead produced 2 whole units of food. Thus, England gives up 2 units of food for the time it takes to produce 1 unit of clothing. And it gives up a half unit of clothing in the time it takes to produce 1 unit of food. Similarly, France gives up a half unit of food to produce 1 unit of clothing, and 2 units of clothing to produce 1 unit of food. From this production possibilities table and these opportunity costs, we can get the absolute and comparative advantages of each country. We can see here that for England, it just takes less time to produce 1 unit of both of these goods. England, therefore, has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. However, England has a comparative advantage in the production of food because its opportunity cost of producing food is less than France's opportunity cost of producing food. France, meanwhile, then, has a comparative advantage in producing clothing. And you can see from the calculations of these opportunity costs, since they are reciprocals, it must be the case that if one country has the comparative advantage of producing one good, the other country has the comparative advantage in producing the other. You can also express these production possibilities very nicely on a graph. What you can do is plot the production of one good on one axis and the other good on the other, and use a line to represent production possibilities if time is split between the production of these goods. So for example, take a close look at England's production possibilities graph. If England devotes all of its time only producing food, it could produce as many as 24 units of food. And if it devoted all of its time to the production of clothing, it could produce as much as 12 units of clothing. And then the line connecting these two intercepts represents other possible combinations of production that they could achieve in their distribution of those 24 hours available to them. What's really nice about graphical representations like these is that the slopes of these lines give you the opportunity costs. More specifically, the slopes give you the opportunity cost of producing the good on the x-axis in terms of the good on the y-axis. For example, to produce 1 unit of clothing, England gives up 2 units of food, remember? On this graph here, the slope of that line is -2, and the opportunity cost of 1 unit of clothing is 2 units of food. So that's how the slopes connect to the opportunity costs. Okay, now, we understand these countries' comparative and absolute advantages. Let's allow them to follow Ricardo's dictum. Let's allow them to specialize based on their comparative advantages. Since England has the comparative advantage in producing food, England could devote all 24 hours of its time to producing food and have an output of 24 units of food. France, meanwhile, with a comparative advantage in clothing, can devote all 24 hours to the production of clothing and get 8 units of clothing. This gives us a world output of 24 units of food and 8 units of clothing. Remember that way back when we imposed autarky, world output without trade was 19 units of food and 6 units of clothing. We see here that under trade, world production is higher. And if people are consuming total world output, that also means that consumption is higher. So everybody here is better off under free trade. I want to end here by mentioning an elaboration of Ricardo's theory called the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, which was published in the 19-teens and 1920s. Heckscher-Ohlin gives us a variety of improvements over Ricardo's model while still having that Ricardian intuition. The main improvement is the introduction of interest groups. In Ricardo, the only input, and hence the only interest group, is labor. In Heckscher-Ohlin, we can allow for there to be 2 inputs. So, Heckscher-Ohlin is a 2 by 2 by 2 model. There are 2 countries, 2 inputs, and 2 output goods. So we can still have France and England, and we can still have food and clothing, but now we can also have 2 inputs, say labor and capital. Furthermore, we'll assume that one country has more capital per unit labor, hence the other country is going to have more labor per unit capital. We'll say also that one of the output goods is more capital intensive to produce, and the other output good is more labor intensive to produce. Assume furthermore that we can just reallocate the inputs within a country between the production of the output goods in a costless manner. But we will not allow the inputs to migrate across country lines. So these countries can't be trading machines and there isn't migration of people. The Heckscher-Ohlin theorem has a really interesting implication, which is the country that essentially has more capital per unit labor will specialize in the more capital-intensive good, and it will choose to import the more labor-intensive good, and then vice versa for the other country. The way some people sum up the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem is that the result of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem looks a lot like you would let those inputs migrate, but it's only the output goods that are switching borders. That's a very cool implication.